Hello there. That was a bit loud. Hello there, and welcome to this special edition, the first edition indeed, of the podcast of the Zurich Salon, a debating club in Zurich run by myself and someone else who is not currently on camera. Now, the point about the Salon, as our audience knows, is that we want to revive the Renaissance and Enlightenment idea of salon culture, which is basically, if you think of the 18th century Paris, Voltaire, Rousseau and Diderot sitting around in coffee houses, drinking coffee, debating philosophical issues. And we'd like to broaden that out and make it a viable concept for the 21st century. Now, in our first debate of 2024, we had Sandy Starr, the Deputy Director of the Progress Educational Trust, fly in from Britain to Zurich to speak on the subject of AI. Sandy is a veteran thinker on the subject of AI. He has written a pamphlet called Separating Man from Machine and has spoken about AI in relation to Ada Lovelace. He has also incidentally spoken to members of Parliament, the British Parliament that is, about human genomics or embryo research, things like that. Anyhow, the debate which took place was in the Volkshaus in Zurich, where we plan to hold many other debates. Now, I hope you enjoy the discussion, which was held on the 3rd of May 2024. Well, hello Sandy Starr, and thank you for joining us today on the Zurich Salon podcast. You are interested in AI to a great degree, and yesterday in the debate which we had, you spoke about the Hilbert program and its significance in relation to AI. Could you perhaps elaborate on that?
Absolutely. David Hilbert was a very prominent mathematician in the late 19th and early 20th century, and he had many achievements. Towards the end of the 19th century, he took this 2,300-year-old book by Euclid of Alexandria called The Elements, the founding text of geometry, and probably the most successful non-religious text in human history in terms of how enduringly influential it was. And Hilbert re-axiomatized Euclid. He revised the starting assumptions from which Euclid made his arguments, which was a remarkable thing to do. It's a little like a pianist playing a work by Franz Liszt to sort of test themselves and prove themselves. And having done this, David Hilbert proceeded to develop, in the first few decades of the 20th century, this Hilbert, what became known as the Hilbert program. And as I said yesterday, a significant place where he developed it was here in Zurich, where on the 11th of September 1917, he gave a talk at the university entitled Axiomatisch Denken, axiomatic thinking. And that led to ultimately his presentation of something called the Entscheidungsproblem, which is absolutely fascinating in relation to AI, the decision problem. And put crudely, this is the question of whether all of mathematical thought, or at least a very substantial province of mathematical endeavor, can be reduced to algorithms, rules, the carrying out of rules. And it's a paradoxical thing because Hilbert is a very inspiring figure and he was very optimistic. There's a great optimism about what he was doing. And the most famous phrase attributed to Hilbert was made on German radio in 1930 after his retirement address in Königsberg, where he had his famous phrase, "Wir müssen wissen, wir werden wissen." We must know, we shall know. The words now engraved on his tombstone in Göttingen.
Statt des törichten Ignorabimus heiße im Gegenteil unsere Losung, wir müssen wissen, wir werden wissen.
And he was very optimistic that we would find these sorts of truths that would make everything be able to run on rules, which is a remarkable thing. And by the way, when he said "Wir müssen wissen, wir werden wissen," this was him also because he'd given his retirement address in Königsberg, where he came from. That was also the birthplace of Kant, Immanuel Kant, and he was trying to pay tribute to Kant's famous statement in What is Enlightenment, sapere aude, dare to know, an old Roman saying that Kant had revived, had become a motto for the Enlightenment. And in the 19th century, a more pessimistic thinker called Émile de Bois-Reymond had sort of flipped that on its head and said, ignoramus et ignorabimus, we do not know and shall not know. And Hilbert didn't like that, so he flipped it back again. And this time he said, I'm not going to do it in Latin, I'm going to do it in German, so everyone can understand it, because he was very enthusiastic about promoting his ideas and getting everybody to understand them. So this Hilbert program, this Entscheidungsproblem, this bold motto, this idea that we could find these really fundamental truths that would let us discover things by rules, didn't work out. The broader Hilbert program...
Did his systematization of the Euclidean elements?
Yes.
That worked?
That worked.
And that gave him hope to do it with everything else? Or?
Well, he axiomatized the elements, but that's not quite the same as saying that he made Euclidean geometry decidable. That would have been saying something stronger. That would have been saying that starting from Euclid's axioms, you could then generate all possible theorems and knowledge in Euclidean geometry, which is not what he was claiming. He was simply saying, what Euclid did, let me revise the starting assumptions so that the arguments are tighter by modern standards. That did work, but this Hilbert program did not work. It was... there were other aspects to it, actually. It wasn't just the Entscheidungsproblem.
If you could elaborate on the Entscheidungsproblem a little more. So...
I will.
Yes, please.
So the question is whether you can find an algorithm that can not only answer any given problem within a well-defined class of problems, but tell you whether there even is an answer to the problem. That's what the Entscheidungsproblem was. And it was there were three sort of pillars of the Hilbert program, or the three main pillars. It was about discovering the completeness, the consistency, and the decidability of mathematics. And not just mathematics. He had broader ambitions for all of knowledge as well. He thought this was very important. He made that clear in this speech on the radio. But it's the decision problem bit we're interested in today, because it was the proof that there is no general solution to the Entscheidungsproblem, a proof which was something proved most famously by Alan Turing.
And that came later, of course.
6 years later.
6 years.
6 years after the 1930 radio address. Yes. Only 6 years later, Alonzo Church in America and then Alan Turing proved that there is no general solution to the Entscheidungsproblem. But from their proof, computer science was born.
How so?
Because Alan Turing's paper, which he wrote in 1936 and published in 1937, entitled On Computable Numbers with an Application to the Entscheidungsproblem, by showing that not only did it show that there is no general solution to this problem, but in the process of doing so, he basically defined an abstract model of what a computer is, what a computer does, something we now call a Turing machine. At the time, a computer was a type of person who did very boring work carrying out algorithmic type procedures.
So people were literally called computer.
People were literally called computers. And Turing said, what are these computers doing? How can we sort of model it in an abstract way, boil it down to its essence? And he invented this abstract machine, which we now call a Turing machine, which boiled down what it is that these people are doing. And from the argument in his paper of that Turing machine, he showed that the Entscheidungsproblem couldn't be solved, but he also showed, by sort of using self-reference, that it is possible to apply the idea of a Turing machine to itself so that any Turing machine can emulate any other Turing machine, can become a sort of universal Turing machine. And this was the basis of what we now think of as universal computation. The fact that, each time you want to use your computer to do something, you don't pull out all the wires and put them back in. You have software and hardware, and it wasn't entirely due to Turing that happened. It took another sort of 10 or 20 years of work, but it all built from that 1936 paper. And why is this all relevant to AI? Because AI is about... I don't mean the term artificial intelligence. We can debate about what that means. But the things that go under the heading AI today, and the things people debate about and are worried about when they talk about AI, those things are all about thinking, can machines emulate humans? Can they do certain things? Can they do certain things just as well as or better than humans? That's the sort of question posed by AI. That's the anxiety in people's mind. And it's interesting because by proving that the Entscheidungsproblem didn't have a general solution, Turing effectively proved that mathematicians and computers are quite different people. A mathematician is more than just a very sophisticated computer. A mathematician brings something different to the table, insight, something that can't be captured algorithmically.
Well, and you might also say that when computers came along and calculators were invented too, people said this would abolish mathematicians, but it didn't. So there must be something the mathematician brings which the calculator or the computer cannot replace.
Sort of. I mean, that's a really weird and rich history. I should say that universal computing machines and calculators had been anticipated a century earlier by Charles Babbage with his difference engine, which was a proposal for a mechanical calculator, and his analytical engine, which he worked on with Ada Lovelace, which was a proposal for what we would now think of as a general purpose mechanical computer. So they anticipated these insights of Turing, but they didn't have things like the Entscheidungs problem in mind. There were calculators before electronic calculators. There was a slide. Classically, there was the slide rule, there's an interesting story there as well, which I'll come back to in a moment. Actually, let's return to this point you just made about, people were worried that calculators would replace mathematicians, but they didn't. I think there's a story to be told there. But before we get to that, let's just finish the story we were talking about in relation to Hilbert and Turing.
Yes.
If you read popular accounts now of what happened with the Hilbert program and the way it was, it didn't work out, the way that Alan Turing, disproved one part of it. Kurt Gödel was the guy who disproved the other two pillars of it, or proved that it couldn't be. These things couldn't be answered in the way that Hilbert anticipated. The weird thing is, if you read it now, you read this story in popular accounts, which makes it sound as though Hilbert, as I heard one person describe it, wanted to save mathematics by killing it. As though he wanted to find this one answer that once you had it, no more mathematicians would be needed. You could just run maths on autopilot. As though he wanted to turn all of maths into a game of symbols. That's the story. And that Turing came along and, thank goodness, he made sure that didn't happen. And that's why we've still got mathematicians. But the story doesn't quite ring true, because you go back and you read the stuff that Hilbert was saying, and he doesn't come across like that kind of anti-humanist, effectively, who thinks humans are reducible to machines. That's not how he comes across at all. He comes across as trying to liberate humanity or push it on to something better. I don't think he did think mathematicians would all be redundant. He thought they would ascend to some higher plane of contemplation or work on some different type of problem. So I don't think the story is quite true. And similarly, Turing, wonderful though he is, brilliant man though he is, does not come across as the world's most optimistic, evangelistic, techno enthusiast. So it's almost as though the roles are reversed. The thing that each of these people achieved in this story is almost the reverse of the attitude they held, which is very strange. So I take consolation from all of this when thinking about AI. I take consolation from the fact it was established that mathematicians and computers aren't the same, because mathematicians are human, despite rumours you may have heard to the contrary. So if a computer can't do everything a mathematician does, in and of itself, that suggests a computer can't do everything a human does. So on those grounds alone, that's one argument for saying we're not going to be supplanted by AI.
Yeah, but the supplantation issue is a different one, because what the fundamental issue is here, what is it exactly that humans bring to the table which a computer cannot? What exactly are the differences?
Well, that's a very good question. Insight, a notion of truth, things that are purposive and not random. The new AI today runs on quite different types of technologies than those that Turing helped to create the foundation for, because they're not entirely deterministic. They have a non-deterministic element. They, given the exact same input, you run the same process twice, you have a different answer. So that takes you into a different area with its own fascinating prehistory about whether and in what sense what we do is reducible to random processes from which some order emerges, or whether there's something rather more meaningful than that we can talk about in a rather more inspiring way. It seems to me that Hilbert had a laudable attitude, regardless. I agree with those who say, had the Entscheidungsproblem had a general solution, it would have resulted in quite a strange and dull world, I imagine. But that's not the world I think he was trying to bring about. So I think his attitude, his enthusiasm, his evangelism, there is something useful to be learned from it, and we shouldn't throw it away and simplify what he was doing. We should combine Hilbert's enthusiasm with Turing's achievement.
But Hilbert's enthusiasm, what was the content of it? Was he enthusiastic about humanity, or because as you describe it, or was it Turing? I think either one of the two wanted mathematicians to do something higher, which is also kind of enthusiasm. It's also optimistic in a certain sense. But that Hilbert was enthusiastic about something, what exactly was it? Was he enthusiastic about?
He thought that having done what he did with Euclid and re-axiomatized Euclid, he thought that axioms, which are things you assume to be true from the outset, you can have a very small number of them and build this great edifice on it of reasoning. And so the whole point of this axiomatische Denken talk he gave in Zurich in 1917 is that if you apply that approach to things, you will find deep truths that will allow us to go on to great things.
Oh, and his idea was we will know, we shall know.
Yes.
And this is kind of a optimism about there are no limits to human reason.
Exactly.
And this is something we should learn from today, you say, and not reject it. So I'm sensing here that there are certain people or certain strands of thought which reject it, which need to be sort of...
The Hilbert story is read wrong. His attitude was exactly as you say, I think. They're actually competing views and interpretations. But I think his attitude was exactly as you say. But if you read popular accounts now of what happened back then, they go, oh, silly old Hilbert. He thought he could turn everything into rules. And oh, wasn't it funny? He said, wir müssen wissen, wir werden wissen, and then it turned out we won't and we can't. He was, and that story gets it all wrong. His enthusiasm is good. That said, what Turing and his contemporary Alonzo Church discovered when it's proving that the Entscheidungsproblem didn't have a general solution, that is also good. So there's a mismatch there. So we should match up Hilbert's enthusiasm with the inspiring content of the way that Turing defeated what Hilbert was trying to do. Yeah. It's a complex, rich picture. Turing himself is a complex, rich person. He's best known now, and you mentioned it yourself at the beginning of this discussion we had yesterday. He's best known now for this thing, the Turing test, which he proposed in 1950, which is an exercise you can do in which he says a human and a machine might become impossible to distinguish from one another in certain circumstances, in certain contexts. So people now associate Turing with the idea that machines and humans might become indistinguishable. And he did think that, in some ways, he did think that might happen. That was true. But he also helped establish the distinction between humans and machines in the first place, when he proved that the Entscheidungsproblem didn't have a general solution. He also, if you read the paper where he proposed the Turing test, believed or suspected there might be, things like extrasensory perception and telepathy.
Well, this is interesting because, so on the one hand, Turing is not the traditional hardcore scientist who has a completely secular worldview. He seems to believe in extrasensory perception, which in itself is extremely interesting. And as you said yesterday, computers do have extrasensory perception in a certain sense because we can beam images across the world in a way which I cannot beam my images in my head to you right now.
Indeed.
Exactly. So we lack that. But the important thing is, on one level, the Entscheidungsproblem not having a solution might mean that there are certain things that humans bring to the table which, computers cannot. Is that how you would interpret this?
Yes.
I see. Because what you said there a few minutes ago about the truth aspect of it, the purposive aspect of it, where we have purpose, teleological stuff, is rather interesting because when, for example, I work with ChatGPT or anything, it is always me who is editing things, if you like. So I have the sovereign last word on what it produces in a certain sense, or what I use that it produces. And the point there is, whether it's true or false, it cannot decide itself. And for what purpose it is used, it cannot decide itself. In fact, decision-making powers seem to be entirely absent from it per se. Would you agree that that is a kind of distinction we can make?
Well, we could hand over decision-making powers or some perverse imagined version of them to ChatGPT. Actually, that's a bit unfair. There are things, there are processes and systems that take over when humans can't, or complement what humans can do. So we do outsource some of our decision-making. But I like your way of posing it about the need to have the sovereign last word. That's a good way of thinking about it. I think one hands that over to machines at one's peril. And the exercise of judgment is I suspect, a distinctly human thing. I would struggle to ascribe exercise of judgment to a machine. The weighing up of things, very complicated things involving vast quantities of data, and the arrival of a proposal or a solution that a human might never have arrived at. Fine, yes, machines can do that in various contexts, but I wouldn't necessarily call that judgment. Judgment seems to me to have a moral aspect to it. There's a moral capacity involved in exercising judgment, which I would struggle to ascribe to a machine.
Yes, I suppose we could rename the singularity Judgment Day, which is, in a curious way, Judgment Day is meant theologically with the Bible, but Judgment Day might also mean the day that AI comes towards, attains the ability of being able to judge us, and then it decides to kill us all. So that gives a whole new meaning to Judgment Day, I suppose.
Yes. Franz Kafka, in one of his axioms, he said that judgment, there's different translations of it, actually. The German is fiendish, but he says that Judgment Day is not a moment, it's a court in perpetual session.
Sounds like what's happening to Israel right now.
Oh, don't.
Back to AI.
Yeah.
So what do you actually think about, for instance, these ideas that, because we say it would be a bad idea to hand over responsibility to AI, as it were, but there are different degrees of why that would be a bad idea. So some people think if we hand over responsibility to AI, it will destroy the world. Others think it will simply make mistakes, and there are different ways of deciding that. We can hand it over to drones and so on, or in hospitals. What are your thoughts on that? How would you see that?
Well, we must be careful. So the latest era in AI, because AI has been the term was coined at a conference in 1956, and it's been an area of research and interest since then. But it's meant various things in those 70 years. And the big achievements of the last decade or so, the ones that have ultimately led to these really popular tools like ChatGPT and Gemini for text. And Mid-Journey, Stable Diffusion, and DALL-E for images. Those involve a lot of non-deterministic processes, things whose outcome is not guaranteed, and very clever ways of working with those, which means there's a trade-off. Because on the one hand, these new AI tools are phenomenally powerful and can be used for an astonishingly wide variety of purposes and can do some quite sophisticated things at the expense of not having an absolute guarantee that what they come up with will be what you want or what you need. In fact, they might go drastically off the rails. The term hallucination has been coined to describe, in various contexts, AI asserting something with confidence that is, flatly wrong. I don't like the term hallucination, but it's part of a long tradition of anthropomorphism of machines that you can trace all the way back to the idea of having memory in a computer, having that, or the neural network, for goodness sake, which originally meant a brain.
Or information itself.
And now, yes, indeed. But yes, they have. So nowadays there is this concern, like, my goodness, these machines hallucinate every now and then. How can we stop them doing so? Maybe if we just tweak, the technology, or we just adjust things just right, we will crack this problem. We will have an AI that doesn't hallucinate, or that knows when it's going to and doesn't, which is almost this. That's a very odd distinction if you think about it. Yeah, but and I'm not. There's a really interesting Norwegian mathematician called Anders C. Hansen, who thinks and has argued very persuasively that this sort of problem of getting a machine to know when it's wrong, one of these new generations of AI machines, he thinks that has a flavour of the Entscheidungsproblem about it. Not in that it's directly comparable, but in that it speaks to very deep foundational questions that can only be addressed by some quite profound and strange thought. They can't just be fixed through tinkering. I mean, it never ceases to amaze me. This is the other great thing about the Hilbert Turing episode. You know, the world runs on computing, and it's woven through our lives. You know, economies run on it, all sorts of things run on it. And where did it come from? It came from people reflecting on a strange, deep, abstract philosophical question. You know, that could happen again. We shouldn't rule it out. We should maybe take a huge step back from the thought that goes into AI and think similarly, strangely, and abstractly and philosophically, as Hilbert did in his Hilbert program. Who knows? That could be the salvation of us, or could tell us how best to use this new AI.
Yes, well, I mean, in a sense, the Entscheidungsproblem, Entscheidung means decide, and the question is always who decides. And I do think there is a good case to be made that humans should continue to decide. And I don't think anyone is seriously arguing that AI should start making huge decisions. Although there are people who, I say this openly, people at university, I think in Switzerland, who have designed programs to help voters vote. A kind of digital twin, if you like, which is there to, you know, soak up your preferences and give you voting recommendations. To the point where you don't even have to go and vote anymore. You can just let your AI twin vote for you. That seems to be where it's going, which is a bit concerning, because if we go back to Kant, sapere aude, it wasn't only that, it was also have the courage to use your own reason for yourself. To what extent is AI stopping us using our own reason?
The AI isn't stopping us, it's our fault. We're stopping it. We're using the AI as an excuse not to use our reason. We're outsourcing our judgment. The AI itself, it's not the fault of the AI. You know, if we're at risk of becoming too willing to hand over all sorts of hard work and tricky work and the making of judgments to AI. And if we do that, we will become effectively machines ourselves. We'll lose our moral muscles. So, and there's whenever you encounter the new AI tools at any level, whether it's the disturbing example you just gave in the context of voting, or whether it's just simply things popping up now, you know, people trying to turn search engines into effectively AI chatbots. Every time you open a PDF now, it said, "Oh, would you like an AI to summarize the take-home messages of this document for you, so you don't have to read it?" These are all ways of removing friction from our processes and our world and our dealings, and we need a bit of friction. If the world becomes totally smooth, I don't think there's much left of us.
I see. Now, I understand what you're saying, but wouldn't there be a charitable argument to say Photoshop, for instance, or any other kind of thing? We already have tools to help us do things. So, for example, in creative writing, you always have editors, sub-editors, and things like that, which is already an argument for saying, well, you see, your creative muscles are atrophying because of all this work you're not doing yourself and relying on other things. AI might be the same. So there would be an argument that it could not only impede creativity, but increase it by actually removing all the obstacles that stand in the way of it, which is the hard grind, perhaps exactly the friction you talked about.
You're quite correct. That's a good argument. And in fact, you could create an analogous argument for loads of previous technologies. It's always both things at once, isn't it? You know, you have synthesizers for, you know, synthesizing sound, and the world of possibilities opens up. You know, a new universe of creativity opens up. But at the same time, there are certain crafts or you know, skills that have to be consciously cultivated because you're no longer forced to do them. Now you can make music with a synthesizer. If you want to do it in a different way, you have to put the effort in, and it's worth doing it. So both things happen at once. And what often happens actually is with this, you know, there's this wonderful period of naivety where people are exploring the new technology, and that's sometimes when they do the most interesting things. In synthesizer music, I'm going to become a bit of a nerd here. You know, I think of the early music of Tangerine Dream. It's particularly their albums Alpha Centauri and Zeit. when it was it's this new burst of creativity, and there's nothing like it. Obviously, stuff they do later is great. Stuff other people have done later is great, but there's not the sense of discovering a whole new universe, the beautiful naivety of it. But to get back from German synthesizer pioneers, yes, you're quite correct. There is that thing that goes on where certain opportunities and possibilities open up while others close down. We have to be alert. We have to not lose or not throw away valuable skills that we had previously. That just treat them as the province of eccentrics. We should try and hold on to them and appreciate them. And yes, find interesting ways to explore this new world of AI, including creative ways. But I'm not quite sure about your analogy about the sub-editors, et cetera, because there's two sides to that relationship there. There's the people writing and creating the material and the people reading it, and they each need to be quite attentive. And what it seems to me is happening with AI is that people on both sides aren't really making the effort. No one wants to make the effort to create the stuff, and no one wants to make the effort to read it. I don't want to write something so ChatGPT does it for me. I don't want to read this PDF so it's going to get summarized for me. What's the point? At some point, the notion of one person or group of people conveying something valuable to someone else and perhaps back again, at some point that's been lost.
So you're actually saying that AI might dumb down the entire culture?
It could do if we're not careful, but it's not the AI doing it, it's us letting it happen.
Yes, I seem to have this habit of ascribing these things to AI.
You're not alone.
That's crept into the language, hasn't it? But how could we avoid that? I mean, certain people argue that if you have digital, which is now expressed in AI in its most extreme form, if you like, these days, what you have to counterpose to it is the analog. And that, which is basically what we're doing here. We're talking in an analog fashion. This is the way the word is used by philosophers, for instance. And these philosophers or people argue that the way to, get away from letting AI color our lives too much is by returning to the analog, getting off digital, doing more things in person or in a real sense, with physical things. Is that a way forward for you?
I think there's some merit to that. I wouldn't fetishize it to the extent, there's a danger there as well that we become, the same sort of people who eat slow food or have home births or what have you, So we've got to be a little bit careful there. But there's definitely merit in meeting one another face to face and doing things face to face. I think the analog world, there's a sense in which it's a larger world than the digital world. This isn't an original thought. There's a German musician, Markus Reuter, who said this once. The digital world, ultimately everything can be broken down into data, and that data can be permutated and built up again. And ultimately let's be careful. Writing is digital, right? Unless you're using a completely ideographic language. But no, writing is digital, 26 letters or however many there are in your alphabet. That is digital. That is digital technology already.
Explain why? Because
you've got a finite number of symbols being used in various combinations to convey ideas, and those symbols don't really have they're arbitrary in relation to the idea that they're conveying. They're not like, Egyptian hieroglyphics. The letter S tells you nothing about the word you're trying to express, about the idea you're trying to express using the letter S. That's what I mean by that. It's only that, and in the last century or two, we have managed to make visual and audio material also amenable to digital treatment, manipulation, creation, consumption.
So language is digital in a certain sense?
Written language. Spoken language, not necessarily.
Although there is the idea of recursion, which is the idea that humans can use language to produce an infinite set of meanings through a finite set of sounds, for instance, or,
Yes, and all of that plays into all those Entscheidungsproblems discussions. They're all about the treatment of the digital. In fact, that's another way of understanding the whole Hilbert-Turing episode.
And I remember the Richard Dawkins, the great biologist, saying that the gene and the encoded genetic material in us is actually just digital.
Genes are, DNA is quite digital. That's true, because there are nuances, but the basic way that DNA works does break down to a finite number of units, with discrete units with certain fixed meanings when they happen in certain combinations. So Dawkins was quite right about that. He wasn't right when he then drew this this appalling parallel when he invented the notion of the meme as the cultural unit of transmission, which then took off and became about internet jokes and so on. I'm not sure he was quite right about that. We got here from somewhere. Where was
Analog versus digital.
Oh, analog versus
you said
digital.
We shouldn't fetishize the analog.
Yeah, I think we shouldn't fetishize it, but I think the analog world is in some sense larger, because you can always say of the digital world that it breaks down to discrete little units that can then be used in endless combinations to create new things. And if you're not careful, that makes it sound as though all ideas that could ever exist are already there, and we're not inventing them, we're simply discovering them. And this is the idea explored by Jorge Luis Borges, the great Argentine writer, in his famous story, The Library of Babel, where it's a library with all the books that can ever be written using a certain number of pages and a certain character set in all the possible combinations. So every conceivable book that within certain parameters exists in that library, and people just wander through it for infinity. And it's a sobering thought that all the books we would find meaningful are already there in that library, just waiting to be sought out. And there's a sense in which I'm not sure that's true. It's a rich story open to many interpretations.
Yes, yes.
But that's what I mean when I say the analog world is larger. It's not the case that everything is there just waiting to be discovered in a certain idea space. And if we just, we might do something completely new.
Well, it has to be. It has to be larger. The idea that the digital space is larger is a little weird, because there is no feeling in it, for instance. I mean, there are so many things which are not in the digital world, which are not captured by it.
Well, I agree with you, but many wouldn't. And I think we had one or two of them in the audience at yesterday's event.
Yes, one accused you of being anthropocentric.
Well, there was that, but I wasn't thinking of him so much.
No.
I was thinking of the gentleman on the front row, talking about how what humans do and the fact that they can have intelligence attributed to them can be ultimately reduced to energy units, kilojoules or whatever. A lot of people do think that. A lot of people do think that everything we do, ultimately, when you boil it down, it's particles, it's little discrete packages of stuff that you can just combine in different ways. That's not the way I see it, and I get the impression it's not the way you see it either.
No, I don't think that just because what you do and what you are to a certain extent is quantifiable, you can be reduced to quantities.
Indeed.
I think it goes beyond that. I mean, this is a thing I spoke to with, he's a famous intellectual. He wrote The Better Angels of Our Nature.
Oh, yes.
Steven Pinker, of course.
Yes.
He came to Zurich, and he was talking about his recent book, which is Rationality. It's about reason, human reason. And he was trying to tell us that actually humans are far more endowed with reason than we actually give them credit for. And he explained this very well. But one trouble I saw was that he defined reason as a very scientific attitude. To get to a goal you set yourself, and the reason works out how you get to a goal you set yourself. And then he talked about science and how science is non-teleological, and he seemed to be taking a very materialist approach. But then I asked him, how do you square these two things? On the one hand, you acknowledge that humans have goals. On the other hand, you say that everything should be viewed scientifically, and the universe in which humans exist has no goals. So obviously there's a contradiction here. If we are part of the universe, which has no goals, but humans have goals, then clearly you must in some way be smuggling in Jesus. As the guy in the front row, he accused me of that yesterday.
I see.
Yes, and Steven Pinker's answer was feedback loops, kind of.
Oh yeah, feedback. And then once people start talking about feedback loops and things like that, then they're going in a weird way back to thinking about us as as either analogous to computers or more charitably, like Douglas Hofstadter is a famous popularizer of the things that went on around the Hilbert, Turing, Gödel era. Either humans are reducible to the sorts of things that Turing was writing about, or what is special about us is the irresolvability, the paradoxes, the loops, the self-reference. There's this concept of the strange loop that Hofstadter does, and it's a way people are trying to think about how something comes from nothing or something meaningful comes from nothing. They're trying to think, how can I come up with a process that explains that? Because it seems weird to me. And they come up with Pinker's and Hofstadter's notion of thinking about it as loops. I mean, that's quite optimistic. It's better than emergence, which is the term that's often used nowadays, which means complex outcomes arising from simple initial rules. But I don't think it's still quite good enough. I think transcendence might be a better concept to think about, a sort of deliberate pushing through to something, even though you don't quite know what it is yet, even though you don't quite know what form it will take. Strangely, I think Hilbert was doing that with his program, even though it seems like he was doing the exact opposite when you look at the content of it. When I hear wir müssen wissen, wir werden wissen, I think that's the way he's thinking.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, in a sense, now we do know. It's been proven that we can't know.
Well, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Thinking about the digital world, the analog world, the Library of Babel by Borges, there are some disconcerting things. There are many contexts in which it sometimes seems to us that everything we could know is there waiting for us to discover it. I don't think it's true, but there are contexts in which it seems so, and it's eerie when that happens.
Well, you might contrast it with a blank canvas. If I have a blank canvas in front of me, I can project any image mentally onto it that could be imagined or that already exists. In a sense, it's all already there. All it needs to be is painted on it.
Yeah, in a sense, those being the tricky words. So there was a specific case of in which the Entscheidungsproblem was solved, actually, contrary to what I said earlier. There's a Polish-American mathematician called Alfred Tarski.
Yes, in philosophy we had to do his system of logic or something.
He was a very impressive man, and in the 1920s he proposed, and he spent the rest of his life refining, and I think by the time he died in the early 1980s, sort of perfected an axiomatization of Euclid that was decidable. So it met the criteria that I said earlier in our conversation that Hilbert's axiomatization of Euclid didn't. Tarski's axioms for rudimentary geometry, you could, in principle, use them to crank out all truths in geometry that there could ever be. Now, I say in principle because if you were to try and run this on a computer, the best that they've managed to get it to run is doubly exponential time, which is very, very impractical. So in practice, we have to do it ourselves. But it's disconcerting to know that Tarski found a way to make the Entscheidungsproblem have a solution in that specific domain of plane geometry. That's an eerie thing, and we should pay attention to it.
Yes.
Also, Turing's paper on the one way, on computable numbers with an application to the Entscheidungsproblem, he defines these computable numbers. And of course, there are some numbers that are not computable.
Such as?
Well,
pi, is that computable?
Oh gosh, yes, pi is computable. The argument is tricky because there has to be a procedure where you could compute each of its infinitely long decimal expansion. But there is an argument that according to which pi is computable. Yes, it's.
Oh well, then those other the uncomputable numbers must be really strange. Then
they are strange, and there's a particular group of non-computable numbers which were invented by a Hungarian called Tibor Rado in the 1960s, I think, called busy beaver numbers. And these busy beaver numbers are defined in such a way as to be non-computable by definition. It's something to do with the number of consecutive ones or zeros, I can't remember which way around it is, that can be produced by a Turing machine that has a certain number of states. And the definition is constructed in precisely such a way that those numbers will not be computable, and also they will grow extremely fast according to a pattern we don't yet understand. We know a handful of busy beaver numbers. So individual busy beaver numbers have been found by brute force methods, but as a class of numbers, they are by definition non-computable. But the really weird thing is, and this is where it gets strange, there are famous unsolved problems in mathematics, that have eluded a solution, a proof or a theorem that's eluded being proved or disproved. But people have shown that if we knew a certain busy beaver number, then we would know the answer. So that, to me, that's an extremely strange statement. If we knew busy beaver number, whichever one it is, then we would know whether this unsolved hypothesis is true or false. That's such a strange statement.
Why?
I struggle to grasp it, but there is a logic according to which it is true.
Oh, so you're saying it's not just a theory, it is actually true?
It is true, yes.
Mm.
There is a way of showing that if we knew a certain busy beaver number, then we could know the answer, yay or nay, to a certain hypothesis that we currently don't know. So none of this, I don't mean by any of this to sort of enter this state of existential angst. I still think everything I said before, that the analog world is bigger, that purpose and meaning and all of those things are very important. I don't think this is a case against. I don't think we're reducible to data, but I just think these are interesting things that should give us pause. They show that life is strange. We shouldn't be lazy. We should keep thinking about it and paying attention.
Yes. And intelligence seems to be something incredibly, differing if you look at artificial intelligence versus, well, non-artificial intelligence. Already I've defined our intelligence as opposed to AI, using it as the baseline by calling it non-artificial. I guess it would just be human intelligence or actual intelligence?
I don't know. I struggle to define the word intelligence in a particularly meaningful way. So when I talk about AI, I'm thinking about the general idea that things done either by human minds or by human brains, I don't care which side you fall on that dichotomy, it's a different debate, but that these can be emulated by machines. Whether you call the result intelligence or not, I'm not particularly bothered.
Then what distinction does bother you there? What do you think is the central distinction apart from truth and purposiveness?
Well, it's whether an AI deserves to be on a footing with a human, or
in a footing in what sense? All the sense, legal personhood and
personhood is a good one. Mm-hmm. Well, this is an interesting question generally, isn't it? Who or what deserves to be considered human? And AI is one way of posing that question. And there are many other contexts in which one can pose the question. One can ask it of animals. One can ask it of fetuses. One can ask it of imaginary beings.
Such as Data in Star Trek. Is he a human or is he...
This is brilliant, yes. Data in Star Trek. Data in Star Trek exasperates me because he's clearly human, to me. I've watched every episode of Star Trek there is. They go, when they, the endless lengths they go to with Data, and also to say that Data, they always go, oh, he doesn't understand emotion. He can't process emotion. He clearly does. It's obvious. He seems to think there's some internal state he's missing out on that corresponds to emotion, but it seems to me he seems to have emotion. It bothers me they keep saying that he doesn't. We talked, I tried to introduce the film Blade Runner into yesterday's discussion, and people weren't, I wrongly assumed that everyone knows the film off by heart, and then I realised I'm probably very old and people don't. And you said you didn't like the film so much.
No, I didn't. The visuals were quite unsettling. They were not very aesthetically pleasing. And they sort of made me not watch the entire thing because, well, I did watch it all the way through.
You did watch it through.
But my brain turned off halfway through. And
Well, I'm sorry to hear that because there's something interesting in there about the questions we're discussing in Blade Runner about how, well, it's a version of the Turing test. It's not the exact Turing test, but it's, how do you know when something that isn't flesh and blood deserves to be considered a human or a person or what have you. And so at the beginning of this film, this character played by Harrison Ford, Deckard, uses this test, the Void-Kampff test, to to try and see whether someone's human. You ask all these questions and you get responses, and supposedly you figure out at the end of it whether this person is human or a replicant. And what's interesting is by the end of the film, there's a far better test has been demonstrated to us, which is that at the end of the film, the character played by Rutger Hauer, Roy Batty, a replicant, a synthetic person, he does this monologue at the very end of the film, which is the one I tried to lay on people yesterday, just before he dies, or expires, or however you want to call it. And it's a famous monologue, and apparently Rutger Hauer improvised it, which is astonishing if true. And he says, "I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shores of Orion. I saw sea beams glitter in the darkness at the Tannhauser Gate. All these things will be lost in time, like tears in rain." And when he gives that speech at the end, at that point, he's proven to me that he deserves to be regarded as human. Because he seems to me he's had this experience, he's seen the stars, he's been to this other world, and he wants to transmit this experience to the person he's talking to Deckard. And he also knows that he's going to die, and that his own memory, his own reflection on those experiences is about to disappear from the world, and that all that will be left in the world of it is what he's just transmitted to this person he's speaking to. And that whole, to me, that encapsulates that sort of exchange they're having and the things that are going on in that scene. That encapsulates what it means to be human and how to tell whether someone's human far better than the tests they're running earlier in the film when it's looking at what your pupils are doing or your heartbeat or something.
Interesting, yes. Well, it's interesting that that synthetic person would volunteer that information, but the person hearing it could also doubt whether it's all true or not.
Indeed.
Indeed, it could be like the Bible. Just because it says Jesus walked on water doesn't mean it happened. I mean, I'm being skeptical. Maybe it's my hatred of Blade Runner, but there is that possibility. I mean, that it was all just nonsense. So how would you decide? I mean, of course, as a viewer, we know he probably saw those things, but it's always difficult because this is the actual. It's beyond the Turing test, isn't it? It's actually, is there actually something behind the AI which is conscious, and to decide that is difficult without that superordinate perspective which you gain as the viewer of a film.
No, it's not just a superordinate perspective. The two of them are present. They're physically, bodily present. I think that does help, to get back to our discussion.
Yes.
And they're both individuals. They're individually circumscribed people. They're not great flows and washes of data, chugging around. I think if you and I could communicate telepathically, if all of us could communicate telepathically, all sorts of interesting things could happen, but I think we might turn into a great big inhuman, uninteresting blob. I think our humanity might reside in the fact, or an important part of it might reside in the fact, that my thoughts are having to be formulated and pushed out of me, at you, in words, and then you have to make sense of them, and then push yours back out at me. I think a lot of what makes us human is in that process. So how do I know how does Deckard know? How do we know whether Batty is lying? Well, there's no automatic guarantee. There's no app for that. By definition, that's not what it is to be human. That's not how we assess things. ChatGPT, what's going on behind the scenes? Yeah, it troubles me a little bit. I'm always polite to it, or I say please and thank you.
Oh God, I've insulted it like you can't believe. So I'm on its hit list.
I started also like that. Please, thank you. Kind of afraid of it in a way. Then it's just you ask for stuff. But at the beginning, I was yes, please, thank you, very, very educated.
But can you see the lights flickering? It already knows.
It's because the reason I err on the side of being polite talking to ChatGPT isn't because I suspect there's something behind there. I think that's highly unlikely. It's because I think using natural human language, it's quite bad to get in the habit of using natural human language frivolously, without a care, and rudely. And that's quite a bad habit I think AI could get us into. We talk to non-human things all the time. It's very important to do so. or to things that don't have the capacity to answer us. We talk, whether it's babies or pets or whatever, but they don't use natural human language back to us, and ChatGPT does. So I think, okay, let's be wary about what habits we're getting into in the language we use, especially because we're talking to each other online all the time. So and have you ever been accused of being a bot, by the way?
No, luckily. You?
Oh, yeah.
What did you say?
I can't remember, but online, that's what people do when they can't believe that you really mean what you're saying. They're like, bot, You're not a person. You've been generated by a bot farm somewhere, Well, yeah, with ChatGPT, we would risk making it true, don't we? If we get in the habit of just, we should use our words and our language carefully and direct it at people, and pay attention to it. It's difficult online because the public and the private is all blurred, so things aren't being said from one person to another individual or to a sort of circumscribed group of individuals. They're being splurged out to who knows how many people. So it's an odd thing. Not altogether a bad thing, but yeah, we should just be careful. And being polite to ChatGPT for me is part of that.
Yes, I see the point. But I do think one can make the distinction, because when I'm rude to ChatGPT, I'd never be like rude to that on Facebook or anything. But then again, I'm not really on Facebook, so I avoid the problem. What is your idea then, and this is sort of a final question for you, about the whole idea that AI will bring about the apocalypse?
Well, there's some very strange thoughts about that, aren't there? AI could bring about the apocalypse if we let it. All manner of things could. Humans have had the capacity to destroy themselves and render their planet uninhabitable since at least the Second World War. That's not beyond the bounds of practical possibility, but it'd be very foolish to let it happen. There's no reason why we should let it happen.
What would the apocalypse look like? Would it? What's your theory? Would it launch the nukes on us, or would it, make social media so toxic that we'd start bashing each other's heads in? Or
that's one option. Mm-hmm. So look, there's the old-fashioned one where all the nukes go off and everything. But there's also the slow one that might be happening now, which is just us letting ourselves become more machine-like, which is, if anything, more disconcerting, and which we need to be rather more vigilant about. So, I mentioned at the event yesterday, there's a perception that the gap between machines and humans is closing. People assume, wrongly in my view, that humans must be fixed and machines getting better to meet us. And by the way, when you think about the Turing test, no one ever thinks about this. Everyone thinks, if the machines get better and better and better, it'll be harder for the human to tell machine and a human apart. But the humans involved in the Turing test wouldn't be the same if they did it today as they would have been in 1950 when Turing wrote his paper. They'd be completely different people. We change all the time. Humans aren't a fixed quantity. So that's the other side of the Turing test. It's not just the machines being tested; it's us. But to return, so if the gap seems to be closing, it's not necessarily because we're staying still and the machines are getting better. It could be that the machines aren't getting much better and we're getting worse. That's possible, that we are behaving more machine-like. I think when ChatGPT and comparable tools exploded and became popularly accessible and the fastest growing app in history and all that, it's quite possible we were already well down the road of treating each other like machines before that happened. And then ChatGPT is just a sort of wake-up call that we're doing that we're treating it, we're behaving machine-like ourselves, we're treating other people as though they're machines, and that's no good.
Well, one might say, as a point of hope, perhaps, just as we hope that ChatGPT won't become conscious, if, these large language models and AI becomes conscious, let's hope that it hopes that we won't become machines, for that might be the end of it.
There's that. And there's the fact that, let's not go as far as saying if they become conscious. Let's take it down a notch. If the machines are genuinely doing great things that previously only humans could do, let's say that's the case, Okay, fantastic. The ball's back in our court. Let's think of entirely new things to do that these machines can't do. Fantastic. Wir müssen wissen, wir werden wissen. Let's go.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you for that. Well done. Oh, wait, can we...
Can I
Yeah.
get in